It was 19 December 1943, near the Italian town of Ortona. Snow fell over the ruins of what had once been a seaside resort. The last defenders of a shattered German regiment, tired, frostbitten, and starving, finally laid down their weapons before a column of American soldiers. The war was over for them. But as they were marched toward a makeshift camp, none could imagine the surprise that awaited behind the barbed wire. They had been told by Nazi propaganda what to expect. Captivity under Americans, they'd heard, would mean hunger, humiliation, and cruelty. Some whispered that Allied camps let prisoners starve. Others claimed they'd be forced into hard labor with little food. When the first mess tins were handed out that night, the prisoners braced themselves for thin soup. Instead, they received stew thick with meat, real bread, and steaming coffee things they hadn't seen in months. A sergeant muttered, "Das ist für Generäle, this is for generals." That moment was not an accident of charity. It was the product of international law born from the last Great War. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had set clear standards. Prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, and crucially, fed on a level equivalent to the captor's own troops. For the United States Army, that meant its captives would eat nearly the same rations as American GIs. The War Department took this seriously. In the chaos of the early captures in North Africa and Italy, military lawyers and quartermasters studied the Geneva Articles line by line. They determined that German soldiers, whether they liked it or not, were entitled to rations comparable in quality and quantity to USS service members. It was a logistical nightmare. Feeding tens of thousands of enemy troops required food shipments, kitchen facilities, and guards trained to manage prisoners humanely. But the policy stood firm. America would not risk being seen as violating the convention. Beyond morality, it was practical. If American POWs fell into German hands, Washington wanted them treated equally. By 1944, as Allied victories multiplied, the prisoner count exploded. After the landings in Normandy and the surrender of entire German divisions in France, the United States faced an almost impossible supply task, hundreds of thousands of mouths to feed. But the U.S. military machine was built on abundance. Army field kitchens churned out tons of food a day, canned meats, powdered eggs, sugar, milk, and even coffee, all packed in boxes stamped with U.S. Army. These were shipped not just to American soldiers, but to their enemies now wearing POW tags. To the German captives, it was bewildering. They had been told that Americans were decadent and soft, their economy hollow, their people spoiled. Yet here, in captivity, came a taste of industrial might unlike anything they had known. Some realized that this food, this abundance, was as much a weapon as any tank or bomber. It wasn't simply nourishment, it was proof of a nation's capacity to produce, to sustain, and to overwhelm. But meeting the letter of the Geneva Convention was only the beginning. What these men would soon discover was that American rations were not just adequate, they were extravagant by wartime European standards. By early 1944, German prisoners held in Allied camps across Italy, France, and the United States began noticing something extraordinary. Every meal came on time, and every portion was full. There were no hunger pangs, no missing rations, no rotting bread. Instead, steaming trays of stew, potatoes, vegetables, and sometimes even fruit filled their mess halls. To men who had survived on meager Wehrmacht rations, it felt almost unreal. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps was meticulous about feeding its troops. American soldiers in the field typically consumed between 3,600 and 4,000 calories a day, among the highest of any army in the war. The U.S. government applied that same standard to enemy prisoners. Non-working POWs received around 3,000 calories daily, while those assigned to labor details were often issued even more. The logic was simple. Strong, healthy prisoners caused fewer problems. Hungry men, the War Department warned, could become dangerous. Their rations often mirrored what U.S. soldiers ate: C rations and B rations, canned meat and beans, dried fruit, biscuits, coffee, powdered milk, and the occasional treat like a chocolate bar or fruit preserve. For German POWs, many of whom hadn't seen sugar or meat in months, it was a revelation. One captured infantryman later said, "We ate like kings compared to our front line." Another wrote home, astonished that Americans waste what we would die for. To understand their astonishment, you must picture what life was like in the German army by 1944. Food was strictly rationed. A frontline soldier might get black bread, a small portion of tinned meat, and ersatz coffee. Fresh vegetables were rare. When supplies faltered, soldiers scrounged or went hungry. Even elite panzer units suffered shortages. The contrast between that grim diet and the abundance of American mess halls could not have been sharper. In camps inside the United States, from Texas to Wisconsin to Alabama, the menu often read like something from a home diner. Oatmeal for breakfast, beef stew or chicken with gravy for lunch, vegetables, pudding, and coffee for dinner. Each meal was weighed and measured by army cooks under strict inspection. The Geneva Convention required parity, but in practice, the Americans often over-delivered. Inspectors from the International Red Cross visited regularly and reported that the food served to German POWs was excellent and beyond minimum standard. At first, some prisoners refused to eat. They suspected poison or humiliation, but when guards themselves lined up for the same meals, skepticism faded. Soon, camp canteens buzzed with talk about the abundance of America. They learned that even the average U.S. citizen, despite rationing, enjoyed more calories per day than most European soldiers. For Germans raised on wartime propaganda about Allied decadence, this was a shock to the system. The idea that an enemy could afford to feed its captives so generously seemed impossible until they tasted it themselves. Yet, for all its generosity, this wasn't simply charity. Feeding the prisoners well had purpose. Well-nourished POWs worked harder on farms, railways, and factories. They were less likely to rebel, more likely to cooperate. And on a deeper level, the U.S. We wanted to project an image of civilization, a moral contrast to Nazi brutality in occupied Europe. Every plate of stew and every cup of coffee served to a captured German was a quiet statement. This is what we stand for. But as the weeks turned into months, something even stranger began to happen. Instead of losing weight under captivity, many German prisoners started to gain it rapidly. By the spring of 1944, medical officers in American POW camps began reporting an unusual trend. The German prisoners, thousands of them, were gaining weight. At first, the officers thought it was a mistake. Wartime captivity, after all, was supposed to wear a man down. But the records were clear. The average German soldier in U.S. custody gained anywhere from 10 to 30 pounds within months of arrival. The prisoners themselves joked about it. They called it the Yankee diet. Men who had arrived gaunt and hollow-cheeked soon filled out again. Their uniforms grew tight. Camp tailors had to let out seams or issue larger clothes. For the first time in years, many felt the kind of fullness they hadn't known since before the war. In letters home, when censorship allowed it, they wrote of meals like feasts and food that was as good as home, sometimes better. A former German infantryman, later, interviewed by historians, remembered walking into the camp mess hall for the first time and seeing long tables covered in stainless steel trays of beef stew, vegetables, pudding, and white bread. He thought it was some kind of trick, that this must be the officers' mess. But when an American guard laughed and said, "Eat up, there's plenty," he realized it was real. That moment, he said, shattered everything Nazi propaganda had told him about America. For the guards, it was both amusing and enlightening. They watched their prisoners take second and third helpings, carefully scraping every drop from their plates. Many POWs hid food in their coats, fearing it was a mistake and tomorrow the abundance would end. Some even buried canned goods in the ground, believing the rations were too good to last. When they discovered that meals stayed consistent day after day, they began to relax and, in some cases, thrive. A few German officers, used to the strict formality of Wehrmacht dining, were scandalized by the informality of American camp meals. Enlisted men and guards stood in the same line, ate the same food, and joked across the tables. There were no salutes, no ranks at dinner. That quiet equality, even among enemies, left a deep impression. For the first time, one POW later said, "We felt like human beings again." The effects rippled beyond the kitchen. Well-fed prisoners behaved differently. Camp morale stabilized. Violence and escape attempts dropped sharply. Prisoners began volunteering for farm work, often performing so efficiently that local farmers asked for them by name. Healthy, rested, and paid a small wage, they discovered a strange peace inside captivity. But that peace was not universal. Some American civilians and even soldiers resented it. Across the U.S., rationing was still in effect. Families back home were saving every ounce of sugar, butter, and meat, while enemy soldiers dined on hearty meals. Newspapers received letters of complaint. Why should Germans eat steak while our boys fight overseas? It was a fair question, and one the War Department struggled to answer publicly. Still, the policy remained unchanged. Feeding the enemy well was not a matter of indulgence. It was an act of control, of moral contrast, and perhaps even quiet propaganda. To the Germans behind the wire, though, none of that mattered. To them, it simply meant survival and dignity. By mid-1944, Red Cross observers noted that many German POWs appeared healthier than when captured. For men who had fought through the filth and famine of the Eastern Front, that was saying something. But beyond the fence, resentment was growing. As news of the generous POW rations spread through the press, some Americans began asking whether the nation was being too generous to its enemies. And in the fields and kitchens of America, a new kind of tension began to simmer. By 1944, the war economy in the United States was at full throttle, but so was rationing. Civilians back home were collecting scrap metal, planting victory gardens, and saving bacon grease for munitions. Butter, sugar, meat, and coffee were rationed by coupon books. Housewives lined up at grocery stores with careful lists, counting points, stretching meals to feed their families. For them, every slice of meat was measured, every pound of sugar a small victory. And yet, just a few miles away, behind the barbed wire of POW camps, German soldiers were eating better than many American households. This contrast did not go unnoticed. Local newspapers began to publish stories about enemy soldiers eating steak and eggs, while Americans get powdered milk. Letters poured into Congress and the War Department. In Iowa, a mother wrote angrily that her son, fighting in France, couldn't get fresh fruit, yet the German prisoners picking apples on a nearby farm were served apple pie at lunch. "They eat better than we do," she wrote. "How can this be right?" War Department. Spokesman tried to explain. The treatment of POWs was bound by international law. America was a signatory of the Geneva Convention. Feeding prisoners properly wasn't charity, it was duty. Violating that standard could put American POWs in Axis camps at risk. But that logic didn't soothe everyone. In an era when patriotism meant sacrifice, seeing the enemy well-fed was a bitter pill to swallow. The tension grew sharper in the South, where racial segregation collided head-on with wartime policy. At several bases in Alabama and Texas, African-American soldiers were forced to eat in separate facilities or wait until white soldiers had finished. Yet German prisoners captured enemies were sometimes allowed to sit and dine in the same mess halls as white American guards. One African-American sergeant, interviewed years later, recalled the anger that burned in him as he watched captured Nazis being served by white waitresses in a Texas cafeteria where he himself was barred from eating. "They treated them like guests," he said, "while we were still fighting for respect." These contradictions exposed the deep fault lines of America's wartime identity, a nation proclaiming freedom abroad while wrestling with inequality at home. Newspapers, ministers, and even some officers questioned whether we were winning the war but losing our principles. Still, the military hierarchy held the line. The official stance was firm. Adherence to the Geneva rules was not optional. Meanwhile, local farmers and industries benefited from the POW presence. Camps across the Midwest and South sent German laborers to pick crops, cut timber, or work in canneries. Farmers often ate alongside them during lunch breaks, astonished by their discipline and politeness. For many Americans, these personal encounters softened prejudices. They saw not monsters, but weary young men, some barely 18, grateful for a full meal and a kind word. But not everyone was so forgiving. Rumors spread that prisoners were living in luxury, or that they were being coddled while Americans fought and died overseas. Radio commentators called it pampering the enemy. A few protests erupted near camps, though they rarely turned violent. The irony was, of course, that feeding these men well had less to do with mercy and more to do with control. A fed prisoner was a calm prisoner, and calm prisoners were cheaper to guard. Still, for many watching from outside the wire, the sight of captured Germans playing soccer on weekends, smoking American cigarettes, and eating hearty meals felt almost indecent, as if the war's moral order had been turned upside down. Yet behind those fences, something unexpected was happening. The Germans, surrounded by plenty, began to reflect not on their defeat, but on what that abundance said about the world they had been told to hate. By 1944, the daily rhythm of life in America's POW camps had settled into something strangely ordinary. Morning roll call, breakfast, work detail, dinner, lights out. But within that routine, something deeper was unfolding. A quiet transformation of men who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler's Reich, now adapting to life in the land they'd been told was decadent and weak. Food was only part of it. The camps themselves became small, self-contained towns with theatres, soccer fields, and even orchestras. Many camps organized libraries, stocked with English and German books supplied by the YMCA. Prisoners who had been teachers or musicians before the war began giving lectures, lessons, and concerts. Some painted murals on the barracks walls, others carved wood figures to pass the time. For men who had expected brutality, this level of freedom felt almost surreal. Work became a central feature of captivity. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could volunteer for labor, provided it wasn't directly tied to the war effort. The U.S. seized that opportunity. By mid-1944, over 300,000 German POWs were working on American farms, sawmills, and road crews. They were paid in canteen coupons, which they could exchange for cigarettes, toothpaste, stationery, or sometimes even beer. In rural communities starved of manpower, the German laborers were a godsend. Farmers across the Midwest wrote to the War Department begging for more prisoners to help with the harvest. They work hard, never complain, and they eat anything, one farmer in Nebraska wrote. If they weren't in grey uniforms, you'd think they were neighbors. The irony was striking. The sons of men who had invaded Europe were now helping feed the United States. Interactions between POWs and civilians, though restricted, often turned unexpectedly warm. Farmers shared meals with their laborers, sometimes sneaking them extra eggs or fresh milk. A few families quietly invited trusted prisoners into their homes for Sunday dinner, a violation of army rules, but one often ignored by sympathetic guards. To many Americans, these young men seemed more like lost boys than monsters, and to the prisoners, every shared meal, every handshake, chipped away at years of propaganda. Recreation also played its part. Camps hosted soccer tournaments, theater productions, even Christmas pageants. In one Texas camp, prisoners built a full stage, complete with lighting, and performed German plays for hundreds of spectators. The guards, amused and impressed, sometimes helped with carpentry or costume making. Through these small acts of humanity, a sense of dignity returned to men who had expected to lose it forever. Of course, not all accepted this new reality so easily. Among the prisoners were die-hard Nazis who saw cooperation as betrayal. They tried to enforce ideological discipline, punishing those who fraternized too freely or praised America. Some camps experienced internal tensions, whispered threats, secret meetings, even a few murders disguised as suicides. To counter this, the U.S. Military began separating hardline Nazi prisoners from moderates, sending the most extreme to isolated camps in the desert. Over time, their influence waned. Comfort and freedom proved stronger than fanaticism. Many German officers were struck by what they observed outside the wire. On work details, they saw American stores filled with food, cars, and clothing even during wartime. There were no bombed cities, no starving families, no blackouts. America, they realized, was fighting a war and still living in abundance. That realization cut deep. One former lieutenant later said, "It was not the bombs that defeated us. It was the American breakfast table." By the end of 1944, many German POWs had adjusted so well to life in the U.S. that they dreaded the idea of returning home. Some requested to stay after the war. Others quietly began learning English, knowing that one day it might serve them well. Yet beyond the Atlantic, the experience for American prisoners in Germany could not have been more different. While German prisoners in American camps ate hearty meals, worked freely, and sometimes gained weight, the situation for American soldiers held in Germany was starkly and painfully different. In 1944, as the war raged across Europe, tens of thousands of Allied airmen and soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire on the other side of the continent. Their captors, crippled by bombing and starvation, could barely feed their own armies, let alone their prisoners. Food became the currency of survival. In camps like Stalag Luft 3rd and Stalag 7A, American and British POWs lived on thin slices of black bread, watery soup made from turnips or cabbage, and the occasional scrap of horse meat. Officially, they were supposed to receive around 2,000 calories per day. In practice, they often got less than half that. Hunger was constant. Men bartered buttons and cigarettes for food, hoarded crumbs, and counted every spoonful. The lucky ones received Red Cross parcels filled with canned meat, crackers, powdered milk, and chocolate lifelines that kept them alive. Without them, many would have perished. The contrast was staggering. German POWs in America were eating the same chocolate bars that American airmen in Germany could only dream about. Letters from liberated prisoners, when compared to reports from U.S. POW camps, read like accounts from two different wars. An American pilot who survived a year in a Luftwaffe camp recalled, "We lost weight until our belts wrapped twice around our waists. We were skeletons by the end." Meanwhile, a German sergeant interned in Kansas wrote in his diary, "I eat more now as a prisoner than I did as a soldier." Of course, part of that disparity was circumstance. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing. Allied bombers had destroyed rail lines and factories. Food shortages were crippling civilians and soldiers alike. Even camp guards went hungry. The Nazi regime's priorities were clear. The war machine came first, and everyone else, including prisoners, came last. But there was also a moral divide. While the U.S. treated its prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, sometimes even exceeding the standard, Germany often viewed its captives through an ideological lens. Western POWs, especially Americans and British, were treated better than Soviet or Polish captives, but even they faced neglect and deprivation as the Reich fell apart. The further east the front, the crueler the conditions became. This imbalance didn't go unnoticed. When the war ended, many former German POWs expressed disbelief upon learning how their American counterparts had suffered in Europe. "We could not believe they were starving," one said years later. "We thought all prisoners were treated like we were." For U.S. officials, this moral contrast became part of the post-war narrative. Feeding German POWs, well, wasn't just about kindness, it was a demonstration of principles. In the propaganda battles that followed, the image of healthy, well-fed German prisoners in American custody stood as living proof that democracy fought not only with weapons, but with values. Yet for those who had survived the German camps, such ideals brought little comfort. They carried home memories of hunger, cold, and fear, a grim counterpoint to the feast for generals their enemies had experienced. One American POW put it bluntly, They had our rations, we had theirs. And when those German prisoners finally returned home, that irony would shape their memories and, surprisingly, their admiration for the country that had captured them. When the war ended in 1945, the barbed wire began to come down. But for the millions of men who had lived behind it, captivity had changed them forever. Among the German POWs returning home, there was a quiet realization that what they had witnessed in America, its abundance, its fairness, its sheer scale, was unlike anything they had known in the Reich. The journey home was long and uncertain. Many POWs remained in U.S. custody until 1946 or even 1947, helping rebuild war-torn Europe before being repatriated. On the voyage back, they swapped stories of the camps of coffee that never ran out, of guards who treated them like equals, of farm families who smiled and shared bread. Some spoke with awe, others with disbelief. If America can feed its prisoners like this, one man wrote in his diary, then no wonder we lost. When they arrived in Germany, the contrast was heartbreaking. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin lay in ruins, bombed, burned, and starved. Food was scarce. The same men who had once eaten 3 square meals a day in captivity now stood in bread lines, clutching ration cards. Some found that their families had been living on turnip soup and black bread for years. Many quietly admitted that they had lived better as prisoners than as free men. Yet out of that contradiction came reflection, change. In interviews decades later, countless former POWs credited their time in American camps with reshaping how they saw the world. They spoke of learning English, reading American newspapers, and realizing that democracy was not chaos or weakness, but something built on fairness and abundance. One recalled how seeing American soldiers share food with black and white comrades, even with former enemies, planted a seed that stayed with him for life. These impressions didn't vanish when they stepped off the transport ships. In the years that followed, as West Germany began its long recovery, many of these men became part of its reconstruction engineers, teachers, and businessmen who carried a strange respect for the country that had defeated them. They remembered the organized kitchens, the discipline, the efficiency, and the humanity. Some would later host American visitors, saying, "You fed us when we were beaten. We never forgot." The U.S. government understood the power of that memory. In the early years of the Cold War, former German POWs became quiet ambassadors of goodwill. Their accounts of humane treatment helped soften relations between the former enemies and laid psychological groundwork for the Marshall Plan. In village squares and university halls, these ex-soldiers told stories not of cruelty, but of coffee, laughter, and fairness, stories that chipped away at old hatreds. For historians, those testimonies became vital records of how culture, not just combat, shapes the outcome of wars. A well-fed enemy returned home not with vengeance, but with perspective. In a sense, every meal served in those American camps had been a message. This is what a free nation looks like. Some former POWs wrote memoirs describing the shock of walking into a U.S. mess hall for the first time. "We thought it was a feast for generals," one wrote, "but it was for us." Decades later, that phrase would echo in documentaries, classrooms, and museums as a reminder that even in war, perhaps especially in war, small acts of decency can alter the course of nations. The irony, of course, is that victory was measured not just in battles won, but in hearts changed. The men who once fought to destroy America returned home carrying its lessons not as conquerors, but as witnesses to what humanity could look like, even in the darkest of times. In the end, the story of German POWs, fed by their captors, is not really about food at all. It's about the power of contrast between abundance and deprivation, hate and fairness, ideology and humanity. The Americans didn't win those men over with speeches or slogans. They did it with bread, coffee, and dignity. In a world shattered by war, the U.S. Army's decision to feed its enemies like its own soldiers sent a quiet, enduring message that strength need not come from cruelty, and that even a mess hall tray could become a symbol of victory. For many of those German prisoners, the war's truest revelation didn't come from the battlefield. It came from the dinner table.